Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to day one of Namibia's small-scale fisheries webinar. We'd like to thank everybody who has joined us today, and we welcome your participation over the next 2 days. For those who are maybe joining us for the first time and have not been part of the initial consultations, we are holding this webinar over 2 days, today and tomorrow, during the same time slot tomorrow. So today we have a couple of presenters, and tomorrow we will also then have a couple of presenters. My name is Alushe Itula, and I am the consultant on Namibia's Small-Scale Fisheries Programme, which is aiming to establish a national plan of action for small-scale fisheries through the process of implementing the guidelines for small-scale fisheries. Without further ado, I would like to invite our day one participants to introduce themselves. We have a total of 5 participants for day one, and I just like to give each of them a quick chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll go right into beginning with the presentations. Johannes, are you there? Good afternoon. Please introduce yourself. John, are you there? You are on mute. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Johannes Mkwaya. I am a Deputy Director for Aquaculture and Inland Fisheries in the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources. And I am the focal person who is coordinating this small-scale fishery project with FAO. Thank you.
Thank you, John. The next presenter is Dr. Clinton Haye. Good afternoon, Dr. Haye. Kindly introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Alusha. I'm Clinton Haye. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Namibia, based in Windhoek, and for the Department of Environmental Science. And I'm also a fisheries technical advisor for Namibian Nature Foundation.
Thank you, Dr. Haye. We have Britta Huckenberg. Good afternoon, Britta. Please introduce yourself. Britta, are you there? I think I saw her come on. Britta, are you there? Right, we can move on to, while we wait for Britta, we can move on to Mr. Herman Honeb. Herman, kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Alushe. My name is Herman Honeb. I'm the director at Hanganeni Artisanal Fishing Association, primarily representing small-scale fishing communities in Hendy's Bay and other coastal towns.
Thank you, Herman. And we then have Professor Elisa Mogera. Prof, are you with us? Kindly introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. Hi, Alusha. Nice to see you again. And good morning or good afternoon or evening to all our attendees. My name is Elisa Morgera. I'm Professor of Global Environmental Law at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, UK. And I'm the director of the One Ocean Hub, who has also been working with colleagues at UNAM and others to research various issues around small-scale fisheries. So it's a pleasure to contribute to the organization of this event today and bring together our efforts on this topic.
Thank you so much, Prof. Elisa. And then one more call for Britta. Britta, are you there? If not, we're going to go straight into the presentation for the day. And oh, hi Britta.
Yes.
Hi Britta. Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Hear me now?
You're breaking up a little bit, Britta.
Yes. Sorry. Another word. Okay, yeah. Britta, Huckenberg is my name. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now better.
Okay. Okay. I'm from the Namibian Nature Foundation, and I'm the team leader for the community fisheries in Kaza project. And yeah, very grateful to be invited as a panel today.
Great. Thank you so much, Britta. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to call upon Johannes Hamkwaya to give his first presentation. John, you are welcome. The floor is yours. John, you are muted. You are muted, John.
Hello.
Great, we can hear you now. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, team. Like I said, my name is Johannes Hamkwaya, and I'm going to briefly present the presentation from the Ministry of Fisheries and the Marine Resources toward the National Plan of Action for Small-Scale Fisheries in Namibia. Yes, my presentation will be very brief. Number one, I will just present to you the overview, the rationale, the project in brief, and the envisaged goal of the National Plan of Action for Small-Scale Fisheries in Namibia, and the commitment of the ministry to this project. To start with, the ministry has looked at some studies which were done from between 2000 and 2018, and the many of those studies have highlighted the gap.
John,
yes?
I'm sorry to disturb you. It seems that some of our participants are not able to see your screen very well. Yes, please hold on while we try to sort it out. Hold on for me. Just give me a minute, John. We're sharing your presentation with so that she can try to can I be guided? Senia, are you able to view the presentation now? Okay, John,
yes,
you can proceed.
Yes.
You can proceed. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and my apology for that. I was just saying that I will present to you the situational overview, the rationale, the project overview, the goal of the plan, and the commitment of the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources to this project. Yes, the situation overview. I was saying that the ministry have looked at several studies which were conducted between 2018, which focus on issues related to small-scale fishery sectors in Namibia. And many of those studies have indicated that there are some issues which are not properly catered for in our operations in the legal framework. Therefore, in March 2019, then the ministry has approached FAO for support for us to look at the small-scale fisheries, and then we wanted now to implement the principal guideline, which was developed at the United Nations to address issues related to small-scale fisheries because of the experience, maybe not only in Namibia, but globally. The FAO then agreed, and then they have agreed with the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources, and they have also agreed to provide technical support for the development of the National Action Plan and the implementation of the principle or the guidelines on the small-scale fisheries. In September 2020, then the consultant was appointed, who is now coordinating the implementation for the development of the plan. And the consultant is the one who is now trying to coordinate with all different stakeholders for us to come together and then provide our input. The rationale for the small-scale fisheries, we have now established that the sector is not well recognized in terms of our law, both freshwater and the marine small-scale fisheries. We also realized that the socio-economic value of small-scale fisheries has largely been underestimated, and their contributions to the national economy has been undervalued. The project overview is that the overall objective of the project is for us to implement the voluntary guidelines on the small-scale fisheries, while the specific objective for this project is to support the development of the National Plan of Action for the Small-Scale Fishery in Namibia. The envisaged goal for the National Plan of Action on the small-scale fisheries in Namibia, in terms of our discussion in the ministry, is the ministry to strengthen, or is the plan to strengthen the alignment of small-scale fishery program, to align the policy, the legal framework with the guiding principle of the guidelines on the small-scale fisheries globally. And we wanted now to apply those principles in our programs and policies. Number two is to orientate the small-scale fisheries sector to be responsive to the need of community that depend on the small-scale fisheries. And the last one is also to ensure that the state and non-state actors recognize the importance of the sector in Namibia. The commitment of the ministry to implement this plan is just that the ministry is really committed to take actions and decisions which are supported by timely, evidence-based, and accurate information to address issues related to policy regulations, governance, and the institutional arrangement. Also, issues related to the contribution, the role, and the importance of small-scale fisheries. The issue related to sustainable management approach to the small-scale fisheries, to the post-harvest and the trade of the small-scale fisheries product, as well as the information system. The ministry is also committed to the process which is active, which is consultative, with the active participation from the role players, which means fishers themselves, the fishers traders, the research authorities, be it traditional authorities, local authorities, regional authorities, or central authorities, community themselves, and development partners, etc. That's why we are appreciating that many of the institutions, for example, UNAM, One Ocean Harbor, BCC, and the Namibia Nature Foundation, they are already on board. They are making their contribution, including HAFA, which also joined us in several consultation meetings. Therefore, the ministry is still committed, and they are also, it's still open to those who might not be consulted, but they might be identified, or they also identify themselves. The ministry is still open for those who do not participate to join, because we wanted really this process to be a consultative and the active participatory process. With that, in conclusion so far, because the details of the process will be presented by our consultant, that's Ms. Alushe, we just conclude to say that the process of developing this national plan of action is progressing well, and it's on course. And so far, I think we are still on course, and we are just hoping the final product will be a product which is responsive to the need to all participants in the small-scale fishery sector. With that, colleagues, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, John, for that presentation. And we do have a little bit of time after your presentation to entertain any questions or answers. So if anybody has a question or a comment, you are welcome. Senya, I don't seem to see any questions or comments in the box. Okay, so then we're going to continue with the presentations, and the next presenter is myself. Let me just do the necessary. Great. So I'm going to give you a bit of the background in terms of the process for implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines for Namibia. John has done an excellent job in terms of setting the stage and putting into place the okay. Can everybody see my screen? I'm getting messages that
it's on presenter view. You need to swap it. Alushe.
Okay, is it fine now?
No, you need to click the display settings.
Oh goodness. From my side, okay, let me just try it again. From my side, it's fine.
I can share it for you if you want.
I know something is not going fine here. Maybe you can share it from your side for me, Senya. Great. So I'm going to give you a background on the process in terms of implementation of the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines. We can go to the next slide. Before that. Yeah, so in terms of the contents of the talk, just a little bit on the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines for those who are joining us for the first time in terms of this conversation. Then we're going to look at the action overview, the coordination mechanism and partnerships in place, some of the key achievements, as well as preliminary outcomes. And we also have then some follow-on action that we want to share with you. And just towards IAPA 2022, how we are looking forward to being able to participate as a country in that upcoming initiative. So in terms of the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines, as we might be aware, they are an international voluntary instrument that are really focusing on the needs of developing countries such as Namibia. And being voluntary in nature, obviously governments need to put the commitment and the willingness in place to implement the guidelines. And Namibia was one of the countries that came forward and said that, yes, we want to implement the portions of the voluntary guidelines that we can localize and domesticate. And through that commitment, FAO was then able to support this project and provide assistance in terms of actually implementing the process, which requires quite a number of processes. And I'm going to take you through those now. So in terms of the value of the action, it cost approximately $125,000 US. The duration of the action is 11 months, the action being this project. The overall objective of the project is to implement the voluntary guidelines on small-scale fisheries. And the specific objective is to ensure that at the end of the day, we develop a national plan of action or a strategy for small-scale fisheries in Namibia. Now, in terms of the coordination mechanism, a national task force was constituted. This task force has approximately 21 representatives. The task force is chaired by the director, with the deputy director as the co-chair. The national focal point for the task force is the deputy director of aquaculture, who is John, who just gave his presentation before me, and the director of aquaculture is Rudy Kluter. So in terms of partnership characteristics, from government, we have the aligned Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources, as well as the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, who have representatives on the task force. Ourselves, the FAO, we also have the Namibia Nature Foundation, the Benguela Current Commission, University of Namibia, as well as One Ocean Hub, with whom FAO partnered to be able to provide this webinar to our attendees and our participants. In terms of the key achievements, since we started the project, we have managed to actually hold 8 regional stakeholder consultation workshops between the period of February to April 2021. And these regional stakeholder consultation workshops consulted both coastal and inland, they consulted coastal and inland actors within the small-scale fisheries sector. Through these consultations, we were able to cluster then small-scale fishes. And as you all know, because we were undertaking these during the COVID-19 period, we needed to ensure that we implemented strict protocols, such as limiting the number of persons, ensuring masks and sanitizers. And that in itself, obviously, did not enable us perhaps to reach the number of persons that we wanted to reach. But in the end, we were able to hold these stakeholder consultations with over 350 key small-scale fisheries stakeholders. And in terms of composition, the representatives were comprised of community members, fish workers and fish traders, both men and women. We had local authority leaders, constituency councillors, some governors also attended the stakeholder consultations, and then some organizations such as the Hanganeni Fishing Association, Ski Boat Association, and the Namibia Recreational Angling Association. So we were actually able to reach quite a broad-based stakeholder group. And one of the the key outcomes as well is the evidence that we need to inform profiling Namibia's small-scale fisheries sector. And this evidence was gathered from the participants, and they provided input during the consultations. Now, in terms of the stakeholder consultations, I think that these are probably one of the most important activities during the implementation process. One needed to ensure that we created, first of all, the awareness around the voluntary guidelines on small-scale fisheries, because although they might be known at the national level, at the local and regional levels, we needed to create that awareness. As John has mentioned, it was important that we consult the respective stakeholders to gather the evidence that we require to inform the national plan of action. We needed to ensure that we were gender inclusive in terms of our consultations. We learned lessons in the field, very valuable lessons in the field. We established valuable networks with a lot of the small-scale fishers within the country. And at the moment, we believe that the small-scale fishers have been empowered to be able to localize and domesticate the guidelines in their respective regions. And so we need to continue, obviously, this process in terms of supporting them until we get to the end goal. In terms of the preliminary outcomes, as John has alluded to previously, Namibia's small-scale fisheries sector was not defined. So we are working towards defining the small-scale fisheries sector, and the fishers, small-scale fisheries organizations, and key actors are all central in actually informing the sector's definition. Because who better to define yourself than you who are playing that particular role within that particular sector? This is currently work in progress, and it will form part of the National Plan of Action, which will later be signed off by the ministry. And through that sign off, it will also mean that the definition that we will present would have been adopted and accepted by the Ministry of Fisheries. In terms of the preliminary outcomes, we have realized that the small-scale fisheries sector in the country has got approximately 4 clusters. So the first cluster is that of small-scale fisheries along the coast. The second cluster we have is the inland and central and southern areas. Then we have a cluster in the northwestern areas, and a cluster in the northeastern areas. Yes, so those are the 4 clusters that we have defined with input from our respective stakeholders. And what we are doing at the moment is we are trying to look at each of these clusters in order for us to get some information and data on the production and the value of small-scale fisheries in terms of its contribution to the livelihoods of the small-scale fishers in these areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of early estimates, some of the work is still in progress, but for example, early estimates indicate that for coastal small-scale fisheries, currently the number is not disaggregated in terms of the production and value is not disaggregated from national statistics. So this is something that the Ministry of Fisheries is keen to look at in terms of disaggregating data to understand what is the production value for small-scale fishers and what is the economic value. For the northeastern region, for example, in Zambezi, early estimates are that that fisheries production potential is approximately 5,000 to 6,700 metric tons per annum, valued at approximately 147 to 167 million Namibian dollars. And the rest of the assessments are currently ongoing, but these are just preliminary outcomes from this current activity. Next slide, please. John has alluded to the fact that there are 5 major themes that require government's commitment. And I must say that the Ministry of Fisheries commitment in terms of implementing the guidelines is extremely strong. And John has outlined the support that is required across these 5 particular themes. And in terms of implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, these themes are not only central in terms of commitment from government, but they are also central in terms of the small-scale fisheries guidelines themselves. And you can actually link them to most of the sections within the guidelines. Next slide, please. In terms of follow-on action, where to next? Once we have developed the National Plan of Action on Small-Scale Fisheries, we would then be able to identify certain areas for ongoing support. Now, 2 of these areas have already emerged and have been identified. The first is to support strengthening of small-scale fisheries organizations, including capacity development. And the rationale behind this is that Namibia has various informal organizations that qualify as small-scale fisheries organizations. And in most instances, small-scale fisheries organizations do not currently have formal recognition. Those that do have are very few, and we're going to hear from one of them in the form of HAFA. So there is a need to provide the required support. The second follow-on action will be to support gender equitable and climate resilient food systems and livelihoods for small-scale fisheries. And with this action, we really want to amplify gender and food, since women fishers play a significant role in the post-harvest sector and they require support. And in addition, climate change mitigation is a central action in terms of uplifting the livelihoods of small-scale fisher organizations. So some of these follow-on actions emerged through the ongoing process as key and important to take on. And very important, obviously, towards the end of the program, which is in about a year and a half's time, is the sustainability of the actions. And as you have heard from John, the Ministry of Fisheries has put in place the commitment and the support required to ensure the sustainability of the program. And then moving towards the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture 2022. What the National Plan of Action for Small-Scale Fisheries means for Namibia is that the country is one of the first on the continent to actually implement the voluntary guidelines. And it would also be one of the first on the continent to have a National Plan of Action for Small-Scale Fisheries. And this type of action can be showcased, for example, at the upcoming event where Namibia can participate and lead in terms of the recognition that they have given to the small-scale fisheries sector. Other ongoing initiatives across the region and internationally are the Too Big to Ignore, as well as the Blue Justice Initiative for small-scale fisheries. So there's a lot going on right now, and there's a lot of traction that is happening within the small-scale fisheries sector, and Namibia is really proud to be one of the forerunners in terms of the implementation of the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines. And yes, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, Senia, for your support from that end. Right. And I'm again looking at the question and answer portal, and there's nothing there at the moment. So I believe that we can continue then with our presentations. Next up is Dr. Clinton Haye. Dr. Haye, you are welcome, and please give your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just get my presentation. Share it. Is that fine? Can everybody see it? Alicia?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Haye. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I was thinking just to give a very brief overview on the last 3 decades of inland fisheries research that was done in Namibia. And this is mainly the capture fisheries. So I'm not going to actually include anything regarding aquaculture. So the overview is, I'm going to try and summarize this as quick as possible. I may probably, I hope I can actually, get about 80% of it. I may have, missed some of the points, but I think the important stuff is just for people to see what was done the last 3 decades and what type of work has been done. And it's important to understand that this was done by several institutions over the years. Of course, the Ministry of Fisheries, NGOs like Namibian Nature Foundations, several academia, private sector. So it's been done over through a variety of institutions over the last 3 decades. And of course, funding was also received from a range of donors. And of course, it's not possible to list everything here. I don't have all the information anyway for that. So I'm going to start off with prior to 1990. Some basic fish ecological research was done mainly on the Kavango, the Kunene, and the Zambezi systems. And some monitoring programs were run over a number of years in some of the state dams in the country. And there has been some little bit done, you know, prior to 1990, a little bit on aquaculture, especially on tilapia, and then also on catfish. And that was mainly done in the south of the country. And of course, very little emphasis was actually on the fisheries in the northern, or I would say basically eastern rivers of the country. And there was not much of a legislation. It was only the Nature Conservation Ordinance of 1995 that listed basically that you can only fish mainly with the hook and line, and you must have a permit to do that. You're not allowed to release, you know, any live fish in any water body, and you're not allowed to use poison, explosive, or toxic material, you know, in those water bodies. But as I said, that was basically the legislation for prior to 1990. So after independence, of course, the initial emphasis was to develop an inland fisheries policy, you know, for capture fisheries, and then also a legislation. So that was quite a high priority to actually get something done as quick as possible. Now, the first 10 years after that was basically to collect baseline data. As I said before that, there was sort of inconsistent research done on certain systems. You know, there were not really much of a monitoring program in place. And since then, you know, annual monitoring programs was actually done in all the perennial river systems at selected sites. For instance, the Kunene started in 1990. The Kavango River was started basically in 92, the monitoring programs. The Zambezi, Chobe, and Kwandu Rivers 95, and the Lower Orange in 1996. And the numbers next to those rivers are basically the number of fish that are currently on database, approximately. And of course, some work was also done in the Kuvalai system. And then also during that period, some fish ecological studies were continued, you know, through at some of these river systems. There's also been an index of biotic integrity developed for the Kavango River. And what that means is that you can actually use fish to give an indication of the health of such an ecosystem. And some biology of some of the fish species were also conducted. That was basically in the first 10 years. The second 10 years was, of course, the monitoring programs continued. These are done in all those river systems are indicated on an annual basis at selected sites with selected fishing gear, mainly gill nets, but also some other gear. The idea for that is if you do that consistently with the standardized fishing gear over a long period, you know, then it would be able to give some kind of trends in these river systems over time. During the second decade, basically, there was also some fish migration studies done on selected species through radiotelemetry. And that was basically to study some of the habitat utilization and movement behavior of some commercially important species. This was done in the Zambezi River because, you know, it's very difficult to manage something if you don't actually know the movement of these species. These are just some of the pictures. These on the left-hand side is basically Nemwe. We've got the tiger fish, you've got the 3-spot, and of course we've also done on pike and greenhead and pinky and several others as well. But these are some of the more important, what we call commercially imported species in the Zambezi and Kavango regions. Then during that time, the fish market was also monitored in Katima Mulilo, and this gives you an indication. These are different species and the prices over a period. It started in 2002. The data set here is till 2018, and of course it's still continuing as we speak. And I believe the Ministry of Fisheries are actually monitoring still the fish market in Katima, and gives you also an indication of the increase in prices over time. And of course you can see catfish in the Katima area are not as important as some of the other areas, or some of the other species that you do find. But that's basically also continuing at the moment. Then also a study, a very short study, basically in 2001 was done on the impact or the importance of having fishing competitions, because fishing competitions, especially in Zambezi and in the Kavango River, plays a major role. And for instance, this is now basically 20 years ago. It was interesting to note that, you know, for every fish caught during that time, 20 years ago, it generated basically 52 Namibian dollars for the local economy. And of course, this is renewable, because these days, of course, fishing competition, you are penalized if your fish come in dead. So you have to actually return it to the river. So this is basically a renewable resource. During that period also, some frame surveys were done, actually two, between the Sesheke and Impalila on the Zambezi River. And that was basically to give an indication of the effort of the fishery and the fishermen in that particular area. You know, of course, it's much more information was gathered than here, but it's basically the number of fishermen fishing, you know, the number of Mikoros in the area, how many nets do they have, the size of the nets, what species do they target, in some management aspects like licenses, and do they need permission for certain areas. So it gives an indication of the fishermen and their activities in that particular river stretch. That was also collected. Then also a household study was done in 2002. This was actually in the Kabi constituency. It's not in the Kaba. It's a little bit mistake I made there. But also, it was also done to look at the importance of fish in that particular area and what other livelihoods do they have and the role fish play. And of course, also a bit of the background of the fish's characteristics in that particular area. And then during that decade also, there were a lot of work started to be done with the communities to look into the possibility of setting up protected areas for fish particularly. And this was started basically with Isikunga Conservancy, Impalila Conservancy, Kasika Conservancy, and then also basically Lisikili, which is not a conservancy. But communities were then contacted and to look into the possibility of protecting these areas. Between 2010 and 2020, basically the, oops, let me just see, I'm missing there something. There was also, you know, the monitoring continued during the last decade, and also basically the fish market monitoring. And there was also a short study done in 2010 to look at the economic benefits of fishing lodges. And I think they only looked at 5 or so. It was interesting to note that, you know, for the lodges, you know, that they generate basically 1,500 Namibian dollars per kilo of fish caught by the fishermen for the local economy, where compared to the fishermen probably only generates about 11 Namibian dollars per kilo for fish. That was basically also 10 years ago. So the prices probably have changed over the years. And also during that time, a total of 10 fisheries reserves were gazetted, you know, where in particular in a variety of areas. And, you know, through the process also, a lot of consultations started with communities, and these are some of the areas. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're also in the Kavango. The lower ones here are basically in the Kavango River. They're also in the Kwandu, Zambezi, on the Zambezi floodplains, as well as Jobi, where a lot of consultations started to happen with communities to look into protecting, you know, the fish resource, because data have indicated that there's definitely a decline for certain species. It's important to understand there's more than 80 species in these river systems, and the majority are actually small-sized fish. It means that they actually don't grow big. You know, the decline is actually linked to some of the larger species that you do find that people actually target for consumption and for actually the market. Then further frame surveys have been done where we look at the importance of fish, again in fishing gear used, fish species targeted, and it was done also in many of these areas, as you can see. And now the importance for that is, you know, it's very important that the research or the monitoring that's been done is targeting all species in all habitats. But fishermen only target certain species. So you need to also monitor what the fishermen are doing. What do they catch? Which gear do they use? Which species do they target? Which sizes do they target? And fishermen will only change if something changes in those systems. They don't change because they want to change. So it's very important to actually monitor the catches also from the fishermen, but we call it fisheries dependent catches. It means it depends on the catches by the communities. But we also look at fishery independent catches where we sample the entire stock, all species. You know, we would like to look at all of them. And then of course we've looked at livelihoods and etc. on what is happening. And then over years you can also follow and actually pick up trends on how fishermen change. We've actually seen over the years our mesh sizes started to become smaller, and our fishermen suddenly at some stage, I think it's about 2010, they started to change from multi-filament gill nets to monofilament gill nets, which is of course now illegal because monofilament gill nets is 3 times more effective in catching fish than multi-filament. And it's very difficult to repair as well. So there's a lot of discarded monofilament gill nets lying around, which is also a hazard. But these are basically now illegal these days. Then during that period also, guidelines were set up to actually, how do you go about, what is step 1, what is step 2, what is step 3? Because, you know, the first 2 fisheries reserves took about 10 years to get gazetted. It was something new. It was new for all of us, the ministry, everybody. So after gone through the first 10 years and all the lessons learned, guidelines will actually set up to look at how do you actually establish these fisheries reserves. And now I must say it goes much quicker to actually establish and get a fisheries reserve gazetted through the ministry. Then also, these fisheries reserves are actually managed by communities. You know, Ministry of Fisheries and some institutions are supporting them, but it's actually managed by the communities because it's their resource. So you've got fish guards that are being appointed in the community that's doing the patrols, but you also have fish monitors that's actually monitoring the catches from the communities, because we need to see whether there's actually changes happening. And for that, of course, they need to be trained. And some draft manuals, we're not finished yet, but some draft training manuals are being prepared on how to train these monitors and fish guards so they can effectively be employed in those protected areas. This was also, some of these have been trained, and what happens is that already some monitors for the last about 9 years or so have been collecting data, and the report was brought out on the trends of the catches over time. And now there's already been several monitors been employed all over the floodplains and some other rivers. And of course, there's more in the pipeline that needs to be trained on the newly established protected areas. Then what was also done, a fish migration study on tiger fish was also done in the Kavango River. Tiger fish is known to move a lot, and was asked the question, tilapia doesn't move that much as tiger fish. Will a protected area actually help for a tiger fish if they move that much? And it was interesting to note that a relatively large percentage of tiger fish will be protected for a certain period if the area is, for instance, at least 10 kilometers. For interest's sake, it was tagged here in near the Mahangu area in the Kavango, closer to the panhandle of the Delta. And one particular tiger fish moved 400 kilometers upstream before it properly disappeared into Angola. And there's actually also 1 or 2 that went actually more than 100 kilometers down into the Delta. But you also do find some tiger fish that do not actually move that long distances. So fish protected areas can also play an important role for even fish that move long distances like tiger fish. Then during that period also a transboundary fisheries management plan was developed. Of course, the Okavango is known in the Delta. Kavango is the section in Namibia, and Kubango, of course, is a section in Angola. And this was done in collaboration with the fishery scientists from all the countries. So a management plan has been developed, I think, in 2013 or so, to see how can we manage the entire system, because it doesn't make sense to manage just a part of a system. It's important that you actually manage the entire ecosystem. Then we've also looked at floodplain dynamics. Floodplains are the drivers of fish production in these rivers, and a lot of really, women and some of the really poor communities are targeting some of the species on these floodplains. So what has been happening with UNAM, with the Ministry of Fisheries, a number of students, mainly postgraduate students, have been studying, what is the impact of the subsistence fisheries on the fish stocks on these floodplains. And we also look at what is the dynamics or the succession of fish species over time through these different phases that you find. So we want to make sure that that these valuable floodplains are protected, and we need to understand the dynamics of it before we can actually, go to the next step. Also, fish migration has been studied in the Zambezi River. There's usually, not every year, but during when the floods drain from the floodplains, millions and millions of small fish are moving upstream. Sometimes it's actually juvenile, sometimes of small size species as well. You can see how people are harvesting some of these small fishes when they migrate upstream. So we're also in a process to understand that. It's interesting, you've got certain species that migrates upstream during certain flood periods, and then you've got, that's usually March to about May or so, but you also find a different group of fish, totally different from the upstream one, that's migrating at the rapids, at the Impalila migrating downstream. And people are using different methods of catching and utilizing this resource, which for me is basically good because it's a huge resource, and many of these are basically just tiny fish that do not grow big. But it's still important for us to understand the dynamics of what is happening before we can actually allow certain ways of harvesting. We've also been looking at the export of fish out of Namibia, especially when Lake Liambisi was flooded. There was a huge surge in supply of mainly bream, and of course that the word got out, and people, from upper, the interior and northern parts of Lusaka, even the DRC, came to Namibia to actually also buy fish. So we were also, with the ministry, also have been monitoring what's going out, how do they process it, the value of the fish leaving these areas. So that was also done. Then also during that period, a lot of, students are also involved in food web analysis in certain species, growth, age, and maturity, the succession of Lake Liambisi. How do we understand? Because the lake is an ephemeral lake. It floods basically for a number of years, and then it can be for a decade or two, it can be dry, and then it floods again. And how do fish basically adapt to that? And also quite a number of comparative fish ecological studies between the different river systems, because we found that a particular species grow different and age different at different rates in the different river systems, because they are all unique. That is in very short. Now, the current state and maybe a possible way forward. Of course, over the years, I mean, in 1995, I think the policy was developed, the white paper that gave rise to the Inland Fisheries Resources Act and regulations that was put in place in 2003. Some amendments were made over the time. For instance, a closed season was imposed in the Zambezi area, and also monofilaments were basically changed from being legal to being, illegal. And of course, a really big database. The ministry has really got a very good database on several hundred thousands of fish on database developed over the year, and they're continuing to add to basically to this database. And then, of course, fisheries reserves are still, there's a number still that has been identified, not gazetted yet, and communities are quite eager to get this done, because this gives basically, empower the communities to actually manage their own fish resources. And of course, also capacity building are being done in a sense of formal capacity building, where a number of staff from the ministry and also, of course, other students are doing their undergraduates, or some of them are already going for their masters, and some even for their PhDs. That's the more formal one. Of course, the informal capacity building is also taking place, where communities are being become involved and be part of data collection. I've noticed over the years that if you involve the communities, it seems like you sort of give them a reason to get up in the morning, where they really want to feel, I can do something for my family and for the community. So that's quite nice to see that, where we can actually help. And of course, it's not just a one-way direction. I know that the fishermen on the floodplains and along the rivers are very, very clever. They really know their fish. If you ask them, where they breed and how they move and what they do, they know. They may not know the technical stuff or the scientific names. So where I'm as a scientist actually also go and listen to them, because it's important. We've just been on the floodplains, where we got a lot of knowledge from local communities. And it's very important that that knowledge be incorporated into the work that's being done, and also to make sure that that knowledge is actually transferred to the next generation. We should make sure that it's not, that we don't lose that. That's very, very important. And of course, the monitoring programs will continue, I believe, because that's very important. Not just the experimental one, where we use, the more scientific approach, but also the monitoring of the fishermen. Their catches is very, very critical to actually have some of the figures you've seen that came from the previous presentation. Actually, some of those data come from monitoring fishermen's catches. You've got an idea how much they catch, how often do they go, and how many there are. And you can easily see if species starts to change over time, whether the sizes are getting smaller, and whether the catches are getting lower. We already got some initial very good data back from some of the protected area that's been closed for about 9 years, where we do seem to find bigger fish and more fish in protected area, and even adjacent to those protected areas where you've started to find, it seems like there is a spill over to outside of these protected area. And fishermen have told us, the closer they catch to these protected area, it seems like they're happy they are, because they're getting higher catches. So that's the initial results are very, very good for us. So we believe to continue with that. So that's in very, very short. As I've said, it's very difficult to go through 3 decades of data, but I think what's important just to understand of what is currently being collected, as I said, by a large number of people with several institutions, and of course quite a wide range of financial support. So thank you very much for that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Haye, for your presentation. And in fact, there is a question here for you. Can I just go ahead and read it out? It has 2 parts. First, it says, could you please reflect, 1, on the effectiveness of the fisheries reserves, and 2, on the effectiveness of the law enforcement in the reserves? Thank you, Dr. Haye.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, those of course are very important questions. As I said, I've just now explained that the initial results, where the one has been closed for a number of years, have shown statistically that there are more and bigger fish inside the protected area compared to adjacent, and up to, this is, I don't want you to use these figures, but this is because, you know, these things are very dynamic. But at the moment, further away, there's even, you know, the catches in the reserve was 5 times higher than far away, and basically twice as high as just adjacent. And what's interesting, also the number of bream species are higher in a protected area compared to further away. And what's interesting, although we haven't really, you know, scientifically tested, but that's what we've observed, that the fishermen that fish further away from the protected area, you know, will use any method. But the closer they fish to the protected area, the more they adhere to the rules, because they are being patrolled. There's a question to go over on how effectively it is. Of course, it's going to vary from place to place. But, you know, some of the places, the communities are actually patrolling at night, you know, throughout the night. They've been very active. But as I've said, it all depends, of course, on the availability of funds and manpower and equipment like boats. Not everybody has got boats. And I want people must understand that the fisheries reserve does not mean no fishing. You must understand that there's a number, we're going to end up currently, it's already 10 gazetted, there's another close to 20 in the process. They are managed differently because they are differently. The habitats are different. So it's not a fixed management approach for everything. I mean, even at marine, you probably manage the different species differently. So here in certain areas where there's permanent water bodies connected to big rivers, you can manage in one way. Where you've got isolated bodies, you probably have to manage it differently. But what's important to understand is that we're not telling the communities what to do. We ask them where they would like to have it, where it's going to be, where they would like to have it, and what are the rules. Of course, the rules must be in line with the Inland Fisheries Act. I mean, you can't have rules in a protected area that's totally against the Inland Fisheries Act. I mean, that's not going to work. Yeah, so those are the initial ones. Yeah, I think it's definitely positive because the communities are very positive regarding this approach. And I must take my hat off also to the ministry that's been really very, very supportive and of course, you know, playing a very, very important role in doing this. Yeah, that's in short. I'm not sure whether there's any other questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haye. There is another question here. I'm not sure if this one, let me see. How is the knowledge of fishers incorporated into the community-based management scheme? And what exactly is recognized as fishers' knowledge? So how is the knowledge of fishers incorporated into the community-based management scheme? And what exactly is recognized as fishers' knowledge?
Fishermen first, they know basically where in their particular area, which are the hot spots, you know, where a lot of fish are, where the fish actually breed for certain species. So we will also rely from our side, you know, we will listen to them if they say a particular area is quite a hot spot for fishing. Fishing is usually good there, breeding is good, and they would like to protect that. So in that sense, of course, we will listen to them. It's very important, you know, to really accommodate the fishermen, because remember, they're very clever. They know what is wrong and what is not wrong, or what is right. So you know, it's not like I have to teach them new things. What we do is we work together basically as a team, and we incorporate their knowledge. And of course, sometimes we have discussions on certain things. But in that sense, you know, we listen to them where they would like to have the protected area, because sometimes they know because maybe sometimes they will even like to have to keep the best fishing spots for themselves. But that's the way it basically can be done to incorporate the knowledge. And it's not just about fish. Remember, you cannot protect the fish if you don't protect the habitat. So it's about the entire ecosystem. It's about the, without hippos, phytoplankton will have a problem. So food will have a problem, fish will have a problem with food, and oxygen will become a problem indirectly from that. Crocodiles is necessary. You need the dryness of the floodplains, the income of antelopes and elephants, and to turn that into nutrients once it gets flooded. So you need to, and the communities, I've been on a boat now for them for a number of days, and they know their plants, they know their birds, they know that, and it's important to bring everything into it because it's not just about protecting fish. So you need to protect actually the ecosystem in a sense to protect the fish.
Okay, we have one more question, and we have a hand that is up. Senia, are you able to enable Ben van Zyl to pose a question audibly?
I already asked him to unmute, so he can unmute.
Okay. Dr. Ben, please unmute and go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Dr. Haye, thank you for your interesting talk. I have actually sort of 3 questions. First, what is the effect of climate change and on those rivers? I mean, you've mentioned in your last part that the ecosystem is important. So I just want to know that. The second thing that's not clear to me, what is the status of the fish resource? And with resource, I mean all the species combined in those rivers, and is there still enough protein for the fishing communities? And my last question based on that or linked to that is there a need for alternative livelihoods in those communities? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. van Zyl. Yes, with climate change, so the predictions are that overall the river's gonna decline in runoff. The runoff will be smaller in future, although we do know that, we're gonna have probably major floods that we haven't seen before, and we're gonna have major droughts, and everything is gonna be exceptional. But the overall runoff will be much lower. Now, this is just my observation. I really haven't studied it, but currently your bream species are the ones that are being targeted by the people, and that has definitely declined. If I go to the Kavango as well, I mean, to be honest, some places fishermen don't even set nets anymore because they say it's not worth it. They don't even drag anymore because even if they drag, which is illegal, they don't even find bream. So the breams have definitely declined. Now, the bream species is more prefer more stable environment. Now, although we know that the river systems have got lows and highs, they've got floods and then also the low period, but over many years, that's actually in a sense quite stable. So the breams prefer that because they've got a longer life cycle, slightly more complex. Now, my guess is that stability is going to change with climate change. So I predict that your commercially important species, bream that's already under stress, is going to be more under stress in future. They're going to really have a problem. On the other hand, the majority of the fish species in these systems are actually small sized. They grow to a few grams. Some of those species can reproduce within 3 months. Some of them within a year. They replaces them much faster. Now they are more easily going to handle climate change. And currently, although I don't, because very few people, if you look at the mass migrations, for me, it's only certain species, about 25 or so of the bigger breams, that's really under pressure. I doubt whether the small species are under pressure because they're not even utilized, very little. So what's interesting, women and the really poor people that cannot afford these big nets are actually harvesting the small fish. So they become more and more important. So we have to have a mind shift where we should have methods which properly is traditional, where the small size species can be harvested. I don't want to go into more detail, but you know, it's like if I kill 1,000 elephants, there's a problem. If I kill 1,000 mosquitoes, there's no problem. And that's the difference between the small size fish and the larger ones. And what's interesting, nutritional wise, your small size fish are much, much more nutritious than your large fish. So if you want to give your poor people a very high valuable source with vitamin A, vitamin D, proteins, carbs, fats, give them the small fish, not the large fish, because they eat the scales, everything, where the large fish are being filleted. So if you've got the hidden hunger, as they say, Ms. Huckenberg may talk about it, is that you eat a lot, but you don't get what you need. You know, you may feel like you're full, but you don't have all the nutrients, where small fish can play a major role in that. So that's something we need to look at in future. And of course, there's a huge resource for that. But I usually explain to the communities with, if we say, remember that the total stock of fish in these river systems are limited. They're not unlimited. The Zambezi can only produce so much fish per year linked to the flood. Now, if there's one cake with Adam and Eve, each one could have half a piece of cake. Now, there's 7 billion people on the planet. You can imagine the small size, because the cake is not going to change. The number will. So people will get more and more, so that the portion that each one can get will become smaller. So you definitely will have to diversify. It's important that they also not just look at fish, because with, you know, it's limited resource. We outfish the sea. How easily is it not to outfish these rivers? So we need to look at how can we get these small fish into the diets of people, which probably will survive climate change much bigger than the breams. But that's going to be a mindset change to do that. And but maybe we can have a coffee once I'm in Swakop again, and then we can discuss this in more detail. I'm not sure whether I answer all your questions, Dr. Van Zyl.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haye. And there's one more question here for you before we take a coffee break. I'm just going to read it for you quickly. The question says, from a policy perspective, how do we determine the benefit of $1,479 per kilo of each fish caught and not released, and that of $11 per kilo caught by fishermen for consumption? So how do we quantify that?
Yeah, that was, you know, I would probably, that was just an interesting study that was done some years ago. I probably won't maybe read too much into it. I think the idea for that was to show sometimes what role some of these lodges can play. Of course, we also know that not necessarily all funds will actually get to communities, but that was the idea, just to have an indication, because to show that also the private sector. So when you start looking at managing the resource, you also have to take these sectors also into account. And of course, with these fishing lodges, of course, those people, you know, usually put them back. So that's slightly more a renewable resource, but still, although for the local, and remember that's now about 10 years ago, so the values probably would have changed. And of course, with COVID, it probably totally changed. But we do know that although the one shows only $11 per kilo for local fishermen, of course, they need to catch the fish. I mean, you need that protein source as well. So that was just, you know, I wouldn't read maybe too much into that. That was just to have some indication of what role do these lodges play, in a sense, when we link it to fish in these communities.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I don't see any more questions from my side. So thank you, Dr. Haye, for your presentation and for your contribution in terms of responses to the questions. We're going to take a 3 to 4 minute break. So if everybody could just grab yourself a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, have a stretch, and we'll start again with the next section for today in 3 to 4 minutes. We are ready to proceed with the last section of today. Next up on our agenda is Britta Huckenberg from the Namibian Nature Foundation. Britta, if you are ready, please can you share your presentation and go ahead. Over to you.
Good afternoon. Yes, I think
it's still not in presentation mode, Britta.
No, the Senya is having the presentation. So Senya, if you can please.
Oh, it's a PDF document. It's not a PPT.
Okay. Yeah, because it was big to send. So I don't know. All right,
please go ahead. And we can't hear you yet.
You cannot hear me. Can you hear me now?
We can't hear you, Britta.
Can you hear you?
Okay. Can I speak on yours?
Just put mute yours everywhere. Just click the
It seems that some people can hear Britta and some people cannot hear Britta. Britta, can you try talking again?
Yes. Can you see me and hear me now?
I can see and I can hear you.
Very good, because actually now I'm also trying to benefit from Clinton's technical capacities and use the same background because my computer is acting up. And so I've switched to Clinton's computer.
Okay, great. Thank you, Britta, and welcome.
Thank you. So actually the downside is that I have to somehow read part of it on my other computer while I'm talking to you. So if I don't look into the camera, please don't get irritated. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for having this opportunity. I'm going to speak about how we, from the Namibian Nature Foundation, in the program Community Fisheries in CASA, are also partly implementing the voluntary guidelines for securing small-scale fisheries. So we are operating right now under a program that is called EcoFish, that is implemented by us, and that is funded by the EU delegation in Mauritius and the Seychelles, and that is co-funded also by WWF, PPF, and TNC. So Senya, if you can please, I will tell you when you should please switch slides. I'll just talk a little bit about the first one. So actually in the beginning, Johannes had alluded to that inland fish is probably most of the undervalued and underestimated resources. And what is probably also really one of the key issues here is, as in many other areas, that the areas with rich biodiversity and freshwater areas are also associated with a lot of rural poverty, and they are far from the political system. So actually, you know, in the Kavango and Zambezi region, I think this is also very true. We're having very remote areas which are very difficult to access. As probably Clinton had said earlier on, we were busy also rowing through the very remote areas over the last days, understanding really how difficult it also sometimes is to maneuver there. So why are we doing that? The challenges, Senya, please, next slide. You have heard quite a bit already about that one. So fishing has been in the past been governed by the traditional authority, but in many areas is not longer executed as such. So the open access as a communal resource is right now governed by the Inland Fisheries Resource Act. There is a certain right that is also still with the traditional authorities, but there's also the everlasting conflict between common and statutory law. We have heard about the challenges of the vastness of the areas, of the commercialization, if you want to call it like that or not, but also of the use of very effective but highly illegal gears and illegal methods that have led to the depletion of the fish resources, and especially of those species that are commercially used. So the next slide, please. Having heard the challenges here, the Inland Fisheries Resources Act makes a provision that is a little bit similar to what has been very known as the community-based natural resource management in Namibia. It makes provision to establish fish reserves for the protection, preservation, and rehabilitation of the natural environment of fish, the fish stocks, and to protect fish resources from destruction, etc. So this is what we are making use of when we are talking about establishing community-based fish reserves. So what has that to do now with the voluntary guidelines? Next slide, please. In part 2 of the voluntary guidelines, we are talking about governance of tenure and the resource management. We are talking about, in number 8, about gender equality, disaster risk and climate change. In next slide, please. And in part number 3, we are talking about policy coherence, institutional coordination and collaboration, information, research and communication, capacity development, and lastly, the implementation support and monitoring. And now I'd like to explain to you how we as the NNF and in the Community Fisheries Program are implementing the guidelines kind of already. Next slide, please. So the concept of community fisheries means we are working with communities to gain or regain ownership over the resources together with the traditional authorities and the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources through a legal recognition of areas. So local communities identify ponds, channels, or backwaters. They do agree on rules for the management and utilization of fish resources, as Clinton has alluded to earlier on. We are also educating communities about the relevance of fish and, internally also about where those new protected areas. People also do police the rules through the fish guards and monitor the fish stocks, as Clinton also had said, through local research. And eventually we get the areas gazetted. And where are the benefits from all of these interventions? People get ownership over the resources and the rights, especially to exclude outsiders or charge outsiders. You don't have to necessarily exclude them. You can also benefit by just asking them to pay. The benefits also include that the fish stocks restore and spill over into the other areas outside the reserve, or alternatively, harvesting of the ponds before they're drying up and selling the surplus. People can benefit from catch and release or from fees for fishing, especially from outsiders. Next slide, please. So NNF has quite a long history, also as you have heard earlier on from Clinton, having started back in 2001 with Every River Has Its People, with all those support from all our donors and partners, to currently having a number of projects that are implemented both in the Kavango and the Zambezi region, with our biggest program now being the strengthening community fisheries in Kaza, which is part of the EcoFish program, as I had said earlier on, that we are running since December 2020. I'm not going to bore you with the details of all those projects. Please go to the next slide. But what is the vision for all our community fisheries programs is, we would like to have fish reserves in about 20 areas, and we are looking at probably fish reserves in the longer term, with distances between fish reserves of maximum 10 kilometers. So that is that we are also having enough fish reserves in order to spill over, but also having enough space in between to have people still make use of fish as a source of livelihood. In the context of where we are finding ourselves in the northeastern landscape here, we also have to talk about the transboundary management of the rivers, harmonizing the legislation between the two partner countries, and especially, issues like the closed season is only making sense if partners on both sides of the rivers are doing the same thing. We should also look at improving the legislation that allows also empowering, especially women, to equally benefit from the resources through adequate rules. And you've heard from Clinton that some resources are currently not sufficiently or not appropriately utilized because of the legislation, whereas there's a lot of nutritional and livelihood benefits of using, for example, those small fish, which are currently difficult to use to a larger extent other than through traditional fishing. So what we'd like to see is also that fish is again back to being a main source of protein for riverine communities, because we have understood also through the research and also the frame surveys that you've heard about, that communities have stopped eating fish as regularly as before. So while in some areas people used to eat fish almost on a daily basis, now they say it's partly only every week or maybe every second week. In the long term, we'd also like to see diversified sustainable income streams that are based on rivers and fish, and to also help financing the operations for the fish reserves through conservancy, other CPNRM mechanism, payment for ecosystem services, and also tourism. Fish reserves should not only be a fish reserve in itself, but also kind of contribute to the larger protection of our ecosystems as carbon sinks, biodiversity strongholds, and also having people on the area, on the ground, in the rivers would help to combat wildlife crime, which is also a very big issue in the transboundary context that we are finding ourselves, and especially with the big terrestrial mammals like elephants and rhinos that are being subjected to poaching regularly. I will very quickly go to the next slide, please. If you look at the next slide, you see on the map, the white fish are areas where we are having already currently fish reserves established. The yellow ones, the hollow ones, are those areas where we have received a clear indication from communities that they would like to start working with us, or where we have already started working. I have to say, this is only some basic landscape. This is not, this is excluding the Kavango, where we have also started working. So we are, after a very slow start of having taken 10 years for the first 2 reserves, we are accelerating the implementation now significantly. Go to the next slide, please. As part of our project, the results that we are looking at under the Sustainable Communities Fisheries in CASA, we are looking at community governance, establishing network of community fish reserves, creating awareness of the nutritional benefits of fish, the local recreation, and also the cultural aspects of fish. We are doing research, monitoring, and adaptive management, and the transboundary collaboration with the partner states. Go to the next slide, please. So going a bit more into detail, what also Clinton has alluded to earlier on, under result 1, we are looking at governance, developing standardized tools and guidelines for increased efficiency and effectiveness. We are hoping that other partner countries in CASA are willing to learn from also the lessons learned from our side, and the errors that we have also done in establishing community fish reserve, and also integrating fisheries with existing community-based organizations that are dealing with natural resource management. You can see on the right side, there's a poster on which we have also broken up the guidelines for setting up fish reserves, how specifically you can go about and what are the exact steps. And as Clinton also said earlier on, we are developing manuals for each of those milestones that help others to implement. What we would also like to see is well-structured joint venture partnership with the private sector. Being a project, we are very well aware that we can't fund all activities in the long term, but we also see that the private sector does have a great interest, also seeing vital fish reserves and vibrant communities that are benefiting from a well-protected area, and also boosting the industry and the tourism sector. Go to the next slide, please. Establishing community fish reserves, what we have learned now what that is in the whole landscape, having also signboards demarcating the area so that everyone knows where it is. And we would like to work in all the areas in the CASA landscape that are transboundary in nature. So in the on the Kavango side, the Kavango Kuvango area, the Panhandle, the Kwandu system, as well as the Chobe Zambezi system. Go to the next slide, please. What we have also seen is that we have little awareness what is the benefits from having and being able to have access to fish. So we are also undertaking an ecosystem study, what are the ecosystem services, and also trying to assess what are the cultural values of the fish. So having heard also that the market values have increased significantly, this has also implications on what the consumption patterns of people is. And we would also like to revert that people are taking pride in being riverine communities and taking ownership over the resources for them to also continue eating fish as a daily source of protein, and celebrating also being riverine communities. So it's not only having fish on the plate, but also being kind of the ones protecting the resources. Why is that so important? Actually, you know, Namibia is also still a country that is suffering from or the communities are suffering from malnutrition, and especially, you know, the lack of those micronutrients that can be well covered through the consumption of fish, and especially those small fish that you eat as a whole, those mini fish like the mbalas. And so that would also help tremendously to mitigate the hunger and the malnutrition that is still prevalent. Go to the next slide. Strengthening the research, monitoring, and adaptive management capacity. Right now, we have got very different models on how to go about. Some areas have one reserve that is having a very strict protection level. Other communities have now opted to put almost all of their water bodies under protection, but have a very light touch when it comes to the rules and regulations that are applied. So we have got everything from no fishing to you can fish with traditional gear, even with nets, but only not with monofilament nets. So this is a range of options that the communities can also choose from. And it's a really good question, what is ecologically meaningful while also being socially acceptable and bearable. So we are also still learning while we are working on this project, and it is to be evaluated which is the most appropriate and most effective approach. Having also roped in communities in the monitoring of the fish stocks and learning themselves what are the benefits from having fish reserves, we would also like to move on platforms that allow us for a more effective evaluation of the data, looking at using smart tools to do tracking and recording of data. Go to the next slide, please. In order to also have information for improved decision making and having management recommendations that are allowing us to adapt whatever we are doing in order to also achieve a better management, in order to convince the ministry that those communities are effectively protecting the fish resources. We would also not only like to look at the fish, but also at the broader ecosystems. What are the interactions of having a healthy riverine ecosystem on the broader landscape, the birds, the hippos, the whatever, because it's not only the fish that people are helping to make a living, it's also other resources that are around the rivers. The challenges, go to the next slide, please, that we are seeing while we are implementing this project, while also, oh, sorry, actually, I think I've jumped one. So the Transboundary Collaboration is the last result that we are looking at, working with the CASA Secretariat, running the sub-working group in order to encourage transboundary communication on fisheries management, but also harmonization of the law and integrating fisheries into the transboundary fora that are held on community, but also on government level. So trying to raise fisheries on agendas on all kinds of levels, and also supporting joint fisheries enforcement and patrol actions across the landscape. So I think we can go to the next slide now. The challenges that we are seeing when implementing the community fisheries program, while also looking at implementing the FAO guidelines. I think what we have seen is that through all the good and very high standards that the voluntary guidelines are also bringing, there are some expectations for us to also assist with infrastructure development, because the guidelines talk about drinking water, houses, processing facilities, but also value chains and access to markets. Whereas we are rather a bit concerned that at this point, we have to look at restoring and rehabilitating the fish stocks before we can talk about value chains and access to markets, especially beyond the boundaries of Namibia. So forming associations or small-scale fisheries organizations versus forming fish reserves and integrating them into community-based natural resource management is also something that we would appreciate looking at, because I think otherwise we are also confusing communities if we are suggesting to form reserves, but then also associations. And it will be a bit difficult to explain what are the differences between all those organizations. I think we are struggling also to provide enough financial support for monitoring and policing of the fish resources, especially in the years before people can really see financial benefits. And that will not be in year 1 or 2, but probably only in year 10. There are also some conflicts with certain sections. For example, the suggestion to commercially exploit what is right now a rather depleted resource. But what is also one of the challenges is that the guidelines suggest to recognize and respect the role of migrant fishers and fish workers in small-scale fisheries, given that migration is a common livelihood strategy in small-scale fisheries. So actually what is meant well is what we see also as a challenge, because that is also what people in fish reserves would really like to see, is that they have the right to exclude outsiders and migrant people who are coming to what they say also is our resource. And I think them taking ownership is also a really great benefit of those interventions. So I think we have to also find a good balance of implementing the guidelines and recognizing migrant workers while also not taking away the ownership of local people who are proud and proudly protecting their resources. That is it from my side. My last slide is just a picture, and I would like to thank you very much for listening and for the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Britta, for your presentation. And in terms of the national task force that we alluded to previously, the Namibian Nature Foundation is also a member of the national task force that is developing the National Plan of Action for small-scale fisheries for Namibia. And some of the challenges that Britta has shared have been deliberated on in the meetings. And together we're going to need to reach a conclusion. And we need to create a healthy balance within these ecosystems and ensure that as partners, we work together, and that the messages that we deliver to small-scale fishers communities are consistent. And I believe that this is one of those platforms where sharing information will enable us to get to a point where there's consistency in terms of delivering our information and our views to the beneficiaries. I'm looking here to see if there are any questions. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. Do any of the attendees have a question? You can raise your hand if you'd like to ask Britta a question. Okay, Britta, I don't see any questions in the attendees. So thank you so much for your presentation. If a question does come through, I will then call on you so that you can elaborate. Thank you very, very much.
All right, thank you.
The next presentation is on the role of Hanganeni as a small-scale fisheries organization in Namibia. Hanganeni, HAFA for short, is one of the small-scale fisheries organizations that is established at the coast, and Mr. Herman Honeb will give us an overview of HAFA. Thank you so much, Mr. Honeb. You are still muted. Please unmute yourself. You are still muted. You are still muted. There you go. There you go. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alush. And also the presenters. I actually learned a great deal out of your presentations. All of them were quite complimentary and it actually influences my thinking about HAFA's repositioning. Having said that, my presentation will be quite short and focusing on the specific issue of the role, although I have added a few more slides. Maybe we could just quickly go to the next slide, just to give you an overview of my presentation. I'll share with you what HAFA is, including a bit of the background. The quote, I can just ignore it. Its mandate, why we thought we think we have a role to play. And then I will focus on the role with its vision and mission, some of the business activities just to showcase what we are doing, including a bit of an organizational structure and some of the stakeholders. I may also share with you our future plans. Can move to the next slide, please. Okay. In the slide, he's talking about the Small-Scale Fisheries Association. Basically, what guided us to get organized is to really look at marginalized communities that are living along coastal towns primarily, that were catching fish on foot by using bicycles, line fish. So it's really people that does not have other firm or stable income source, but rather making life out of fishing activities, small-scale fishing activities. Next slide. We have got two types of memberships. When we are trying to define small-scale fishers, we were confronted with a lot of issues, categorize them into two. What we regard as our core market beneficiaries, classified as permanent members, while any others that buys into HAFA's objectives and that supports the agenda of HAFA are regarded as associate members, as not want to discriminate people. And now under permanent members, as I mentioned earlier, it's marginalized Namibians who does not have great wealth and or any well-paid full-time employment. These are the guys that are, as I mentioned, catching fish on a daily basis, walking from homes to the sea, sometimes using bicycles, covering 3 to 10, 20 kilometers just to access fish at the sea. Those that are living primarily in the shed dwellings and so on. Associate members, and these are now more of full-time members that have got more benefits compared to associate members. Associate members are anyone who buys into objectives of HAFA to supporting the marginalized communities. They use fishing activity as part-time and sometimes for recreational purpose or simply for tourism. This may include professionals, students, youth, or people in other towns that makes occasional visits to Hendy's Bay. Some are having fishers clubs, including in educational institutions like UNAM, students or school clubs. Those are regarded under associate membership. These are more short-term membership, whereas permanent members are annually registered for full year, while the others are membership are considered on 3 to 6 month basis for renewals. Now we can move to the next slide, please. Yeah, that is a slide that I was just referring to, quoting about give men fish and you will feed them for life. Give men knowledge and fishing gear and they will feed themselves. And that last part is the role that we are playing. So it's a whole combination of activities that we undertake so that people can become self-reliant in terms of household food security and other basic needs. Now, our focus is certainly on small-scale fishing community. We are trying still to define, and now that we attended WIWH and FAO workshops, we feel much more secured in being part of redefining what we mean by small-scale fishing community. We can move to the next slide. This is just a brief background. It talks about how small-scale fishers got organized into Hanganini. It is a very interesting history. People prior to independence were participating in informal fishing activities with or without permits. And there was a growing tension that caused them to go into even illegal fishing, because they could see how big companies and foreign people were benefiting from the fishery and marine resources. In fact, over exploiting the resources. Therefore, these people were actually participating in the fishing activities, got confronted by the Ministry of Fisheries inspectors, and eventually they decided to form an association to legally participate in the fishing activities and to trade with it. The Ministry of Fisheries was quite instrumental in facilitating this process, and therefore they still remain the custodian of HAFA as an organization. We maintain regular contact and regular consultations as it is growing to becoming a commendable association in the country. This slide is basically talking about the background and other stakeholders that participated in supporting Hanganini and where it is today. We can move to the next slide. Right, this is also the same. There was a clear intention of the government through the Ministry of Fisheries to control illegal fishing and trading. And that is why they have facilitated the establishment of Hanganini. There seems to be a question.
No, there's no question, Mr. Hone. Please continue.
Okay. In 2003, Hanganini was started informally and then got well organized into an association eventually, and under the supervision of the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources. It got registered eventually as under Section 21 Act as a trust. It has got its headquarters in Henry's Bay, but it has now expanded its services to Swakopmund and Walvis Bay to take care of the small-scale fishing community in those towns, including Livelihoods. Well, with the previous leadership under the ministry encouraged Hanganini to look into other areas as well that are not attended, including river and fishing communities. From what I've listened to the previous presenters, it seems to be that there's quite a lot that has been done from where Hanganini may also learn as an association. Right, maybe we can move on to the next slide. Okay, this slide is also talking the same thing. We can move on. Maybe just to emphasize the fact that HAFA is registered as a non-profit trust, meaning that whatever income we get out of the government objective allocation or from the line fishing activities of the fishermen, it is plowed back into the organization's growth and the service provision to the fishermen and women. There is no shares in basic, in true sense. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, the mandate, where it got its mandate from, HAFA's recognition is based on the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources policy that was reviewed in 2014, which of course the establishment of member-based small-scale fishing associations, including institutions like Namibia Fish Consumption. So on the basis of that, we advanced the better organization of the association that provides support to small-scale fishing communities, especially living along the coast, to explore into fishery and other marine resource activities. With this, we signed a memorandum of understanding, and we are now currently busy reviewing that to sign a memorandum of cooperation with the Ministry of Fisheries, as these two structures have got both expectations from each other. We can move on to the next slide. The role of Untitled, in short, is to organize small-scale fishermen and women into a formal structure to be legally recognized and to be representing the communities living along coastal towns and riverine areas, so as to benefit from fishery and marine resources, including other initiatives that may enhance their livelihoods. It's also to coordinate and plan activities related to the benefit of the small-scale fishing communities. That is to advocate for the creation of enabling environments socially, economically, and legally to partake meaningfully in the mainstream economy of Namibia. It is also to support the institutional and membership capacity to monitoring and evaluation, including research capacities. We have seen that our traditional fishers have a wealth of information that is not documented. So we are also including the component of research, and we may partner with UNAM as they are also sitting in our board. We can move on to the next structure. That is simply our vision and mission to be a sustainable organization contributing to social and economic well-being of its small-scale fishing communities. Our mission, therefore, is to improve the lives of the national small-scale fishing communities through sustainable livelihood creation based on fishery and marine resources utilization. Next slide. These are some of the activities, practical activities that we are undertaking under the process to enhance support to fishers. For example, we still want to maintain the fundamental issue of being member-based. Therefore, we've got representatives from the fishing communities into our governance structure, and they also play instrumental role in management of the organization. We, as a structure, advocate in the interest of fishers with and for them. We mobilize fisher membership to becoming legal fishers and traders. There's still a growing illegal fishing and trading, so we need to adjust ourselves to encourage fishing communities to be part of Untitled. We register them on an annual basis, almost hundreds of them, around 100 membership. We support them logistically to go out fishing to the remote areas along the coast. The fishers bring their catches to their processing plant. We weigh them, we take the data, and their payments are being processed on a weekly to bi-weekly basis. That is being done through EFT. in terms of the price determination, they are fully participating in determining the price. If they monitor the market and they see that the price of the KW is increasing, of course, we sit down, we determine the price, we adjust the price. So it's a flexible system. And we also ensure that they get preference in terms of employment opportunities. For example, jobs and contracts, we consider, or we give them preference as members. In terms of specific support to fishers, when we initiate business projects, they are part and parcel of such initiatives, as it is meant for job creation and or wealth creation. Hungarian SS Structure assists them with fishing gear and related needs, sometimes in collaboration with the donors as well. We assist or facilitate training and mentoring activities, sometimes solely or in collaboration with other stakeholders, be it UNAM, BCC, NAMFI, and so on. We support them logistical as well as transport, as I mentioned, to far distant areas, including supply of other accessories, like cool boxes, for example, and camping equipment, tents, chairs, and so on. We support them with the marketing and selling of the fish. We have got credit facilities and sometimes special discounts under our shops or outlets, especially baits and even other fish products, which if they want to buy, we have such opportunities for them. We've got group health schemes and Social Security Commission services where they are participating as part of their welfare initiative. We also provide donations and subsidies on traveling to social events, especially if it is funerals or very important events that are affecting our fishermen and women. In terms of funerals or deaths, we are also supporting fishermen direct as well as core family members, be it parents and children. Especially with the health protocols like COVID, we realized that we have to support them to ensure that they are safe. Yeah, maybe we can move to the next slide. And that is basically how Hungarian as an organization is organized into a structure. We've got the board members where Hungarians or half a fishermen reps are sitting, including Minister of Fisheries, heads by municipality, reps from UNAM, reps from National Planning Commission. We just lost the representative from National Planning Commission, let his soul rest in peace. And then we have got community representatives as well as Namibia Fish Consumption Promotion Trust representative. So from the Fishers Committee that are representing members, they select a representative that should serve in the governance structure. Under the governance structure, we have got an executive committee, then the management consisting of the director, accountant, and the business development officer. And then we've got a number of other positions within the organization to ensure that our fish products are of great quality and our fish products are well packaged and sold to the market. We can move on to the next slide. Those are some of our key stakeholders and partners. As I mentioned earlier, UNAM, business partners, Ministry of Fisheries, National Planning Commission, local authority, and we'll extend the partnerships to other local authorities as we're moving into their towns, National Namibia Fish Consumption Promotion Trust and donors. But the primary focus is on small-scale fishing communities. We can move on to the next slide. These are some of our future plans. That is to review the Constitution and continue review of our governance structure to be truly representative, including the policies and systems. We are reviewing our national repositioning. Even there's been a directive. Having listened to presentations, it means there's a lot of collaborative efforts that we have to undertake, like the clusters that has been mentioned, associations that are being mentioned in your presentations, colleagues. But our focus for now is primarily on coastal towns of Walvis Bay, Swakop, and Livelihoods. Review of business model to have more feasible business activities and operations. Establish projects for wealth and job creation, restaurants, conferences, because of the pressure that is on the fishery and marine resources. We have to diversify and add value to our products and services. Some of the initiatives are fishing tours, development of and implementation of resource mobilization advocacy strategies. We are also to encourage women, because that is one of the challenges that we have, including youth participation in Hangananing. In short, these are some of the issues that I wanted to share with the rest of the colleagues. If there are questions, possibly we can entertain that. Thank you, Alusha.
Thank you so much, Herman, for your presentation. And in fact, there is already one question for you here. One of the panelists is asking if there is a fee for associate members as well. Is there a fee for associate members as well? That's one of the questions you have received.
Yes, indeed, there are fees for both full permanent members and associate members. Annual registration or registration fees are standard. Application fees actually $10, and annual fees, monthly fee is $5 on a monthly basis.
Okay, great, thank you. There's another question here, which is asking whether HAFA can consider all stakeholders, not only from SANUMARC, but also those who I suppose have a role to play in terms of the economic, sociological dimensions of sustainability. Is that a consideration?
Certainly, we are not limited to UNAM, SANUMARC only. We have SANUMARC as a strategic partner because of being based in Hendy's Bay and being a research institution, and they are serving in our governance structure. Yes, certainly we have to identify other relevant partnerships that can advance and support HAFA's ultimate goal.
Okay, thank you. All right, I don't see any more questions for you here, Mr. Honep. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to you for your presentation. And if another question does pop up, I will be sure to call on you for a response. Thank you so much. And before we move to our last presentation for the day, there is a question here to Britta. Britta, the question is around the last comments that you made during your presentation, and the panel member would like to understand. They say that the small-scale fisheries guidelines are based on the concept that we need to combine socioeconomic development with responsible fisheries, as small-scale fishing communities often have multiple concerns and may not be able to focus on resource management if other priorities are also not addressed. And the question is, how can this be done in the case of Namibia? And the panelist is of the view that focusing first on resource management and only later on other aspects does not seem right, and that the two needs to be combined. Britta, you're welcome to come in with a response. Thank you. Am I the only one who can't hear Britta?
I cannot hear her either. Maybe she went
Britta,
back
we
to the
cannot
previous-
hear you. Yeah, we cannot hear you, but maybe to facilitate the discussion, Britta had written back in terms of response saying that they have.
Hello, can you hear me? Alicia?
Hi, Britta.
Alicia?
Can you go ahead? The floor is yours. Sorry, Britta, we cannot hear you. So I'm just going to read the response that you gave to that question here, where you say that you've seen that the consultations around the guidelines have sparked some expectations to develop value chains around fish. And on the other hand, we are aware that resources are depleted. So for now, your feeling is that we should focus more on restoration with a vision to develop value chains in the longer term, but based on improved fish stocks. So that is the response to that question. And colleagues, we can keep these discussions going, whether bilaterally across networks and so forth. So we can keep these discussions ongoing post the webinar. Since we cannot hear Britta, in order to have the discussion going, I'd like to call upon the last presenter for the day, Professor Elisa. Professor Elisa, if you are ready, kindly share your presentation. The floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and I'm aware of the time and being last, so perhaps I'll try and keep it short if I can. I think this is a presentation that's a hybrid of something that FAO had already prepared for the regional workshops on the legislative guidance on small-scale fisheries. And I have tried to include insights from the One Ocean Hub research so as to help the discussion at the national level around ensuring that in developing the policy for implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines, all the relevant instruments on relevant international instruments, both from an environmental perspective and human rights perspective, are fully taken into account and can support the good practices, many of which were already identified today, as well as help all those involved to really make sure that all considerations have been made to ensure that we have both an ecosystem approach to fisheries and a human rights-based approach for the rights of small-scale fishers. So without further ado, I'll just give a quick introduction about the multiple international instruments that are relevant for small-scale fishers, but then really zoom in on a few key questions. And the idea is that hopefully this will provide a framework for then listening tomorrow to the research findings of our Ocean Hub colleagues at the University of Namibia, who have tried to look into these questions through empirical sociological research as well as legal research. And hopefully we can see how we can best use their findings as part of the policy process in Namibia. So as you probably all know, the small-scale fisheries guidelines already very much indicate how important it is that there is a good alignment with international human rights instruments and particularly international human rights instruments and environmental ones. And so we see this need to devise an approach that both is ecosystem-based and human rights-based. And this is very much in line with some indications that we find in international law of the sea. Is really part of understanding what the needs of small-scale fishers are and how they need to be integrated into an overall responsible fisheries management approach. Many of you have already mentioned how important it is to integrate their knowledge, and also how effective and productive it has been to include them as early on as possible in planning processes, the policy making process. And these are indeed good practice, but are also international obligations that come both from the law of the sea, also from many instruments that FAO has developed to make sure we, in the fisheries sector, we protect the right to food. We look at the responsible governance of tenure of natural resources, which include fishing grounds and fishing resources, And we also support and ensure the responsible conduct of investors, including foreign investors that may be involved in large-scale fisheries, for instance. But a lot of indications are captured in the small-scale fisheries guidelines, are based on multiple international human rights instruments to which Namibia is a party or has been a supporter. Importantly, also the African Charter on Human and People's Rights is relevant, but also the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and a more recent declaration on the rights of peasants and people working in rural areas. And we can see how while these are all very different international instruments, they converge on certain key points to be taken into account in the context of small-scale fisheries policy. International environmental law is equally very relevant here. We've discussed climate change and of course biodiversity, and the sustainability of fish stocks is very much understood as a question of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity as part of the ecosystem approach. And what we have understood more and more is how actually protecting human rights really contributes to better environmental protection and the other way around. And we really need to find ways at the national level to make sure that these two sets of international obligations go hand in hand and help each other, as opposed to see them in a tension with each other. And what that requires is, first of all, to having the understanding of all that's at stake, the sustainability of fisheries activities, but also dependencies on fisheries related to the right to food, cultural and spiritual connections to fishing grounds and fishing activities, and finding a reasonable balance between the need to protect biodiversity and other legitimate societal goals, particularly when we may have international protection of relevant human rights. And so at the very least, the approaches we are taking should not lead to any unjustified and foreseeable infringements of human rights, including the human rights of small-scale fishers. And we have to be very careful about avoiding discrimination, which can be on different grounds, gender or race, and non-regression, not leading to a situation where our standards, either in terms of environmental sustainability or human rights, are lower than they were before. Now, going directly into why is this relevant for the work that's going on in Namibia, a key question that it's always very critical and important to be addressed in a contextual and participatory manner is, who are the small-scale fishers that will benefit from the policy? Now, this is a very complicated question. And in fact, in international law, we don't have one straightforward answer, but we have several elements that are important so that when we have discussions at the national level, we are sure that we are covering all relevant considerations. And so on the Convention on Biological Diversity, there's a lot of emphasis on the knowledge, local knowledge of resources, customary uses of resources. On the FAO side, a lot of attention on customary tenure of lands, of fishing grounds, of fishing resources. On the side of the rights of indigenous peoples, that special relationship, intimate relationship with ecosystems, both for material needs and cultural life. And also looking at historic reasons why certain groups have been disproportionately removed or negatively affected in fisheries management, and how that contributes to making them more vulnerable in their human rights in terms of decisions that are taken in terms of fisheries management. So really an attention to the right to property, the right to culture, right to foods, and the identities of different groups that relate and are dependent on fishing grounds and fishing resources. And I think so one crucial question here is to make sure that while we define this concept at the national level, to make sure that all those responsible for implementation are clear about the beneficiaries and the rights holders, we don't inadvertently exclude certain groups that are entitled to the protection afforded to them as small-scale fishers. And so one important aspect that I'm sure my colleagues from University of Namibia will discuss tomorrow is, for instance, what about groups that used to be involved in small-scale fishers, but are no longer based on the coast? What if their tenure rights have been undermined to a point that they may no longer have access to fishing grounds and resources, and yet continue to have relevant knowledge and cultural connections and dependencies for their culture and food from fisheries resources. So this is just to show that I'm sure a lot of work has been done in the context of the process of developing the national policy on small-scale fisheries. And it'd be really interesting to hear, based on this presentation and tomorrow, whether there are an understanding that the process has been complete in a way, or if there are still interesting questions to be addressed around who are the small-scale fishers and how we can best ensure in the next phases that we include other groups if for any reasons those not all relevant ones have been included yet, or there are questions about whether any questions of maybe further research that is needed to understand that. The second point of practical relevance of international instruments in the context of Namibian small-scale fishers is to do with safeguards and really understanding, even when we recognize and manage to protect the rights of small-scale fishers to have access to resources, we need to protect those rights against interferences, either by third parties or potentially by the government, who may be pursuing other policy interests at the same time. And we know that fisheries generally, and small-scale fisheries in particular, are often in competition with other ocean uses. And so here we see how important, both from an international environmental perspective, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and a human rights perspective, we have really focused on three key safeguards. The importance of prior impact assessments to make sure that we take into account all the needs and knowledge of small-scale fishers before certain activities are proposed on lands, including fishing grounds that may be using traditionally. Seeking their consent, free prior informed consent, including for using their knowledge. And which was a point that was raised, I think, in previous presentation. It's really interesting to hear that experience. How can we ensure that we share benefits arising from the sustainable use of fisheries in a way that is fair and equitable for small-scale fishers? And these are really important safeguards that have been discussed internationally a lot. In some ways, they're very demanding for many states across the world. On the other hand, they can really work as a critical tool in the implementation of the policy and potentially also legislation in Namibia to make sure that we have basically processes for the continued collaboration between small-scale fishers, fisheries management authorities, other actors in the sector, and really have this specific approaches to how we understand continuing and new issues for small-scale fishers, threats to their rights, and also ensure that we make use of their contributions in advancing the implementation of the policy and the realization of the objectives, including the protection and full realization of the human rights of small-scale fishers. And so to make this a bit more practical and a bit more concrete, we have useful international guidance, mainly developed under the Convention on Biological Diversity, that gives step-by-step suggestions on how to make sure that when we carry out impact assessments or we seek consent, we really cover all the bases to make sure that we are taking into account both the knowledge and the insights from small-scale fishers, but also really understand their needs and their priorities in their own terms. And through that, find a shared understanding of a viable, sustainable way to manage fishing resources. And so, for instance, some of the things that are usually maybe a bit beyond the kind of more, let's say, mainstream approaches to sustainable fisheries have to do with engaging with small-scale fishers' beliefs, languages, traditional tenure approaches, transgenerational aspects, which have been mentioned before, looking at whether we can use their own methodologies and also understanding what not only capacity, but maybe resources are needed for small-scale fishers, either as indigenous people or as local communities to be effectively participating in these processes. And then that support can be human resources, can be financial, it may also be legal support. Because the key understanding here is that small-scale fishers and indigenous peoples are often at a disadvantage in those discussions. These processes are essential for conveying their views and their needs and their knowledge, and yet they're not quite at the same level of other participants, and particularly if there is maybe also participation from larger scale fishers, but potentially also with the government, to be in a partnership building dialogue in this context. And so the need to understand the variety of topics that from their perspective are essential in this conversation is crucial, but equally making sure that small-scale fishers are equipped and supported in conveying and contributing those views on all these different aspects to the process. Another set of guidelines from the Convention on Biological Diversity also speaks about other elements following on from impact assessment. Really, how do you have the process of consultation? And they really stress the importance of that being a continuous process, not just a one-off tick box exercise, but where you really build the basis for an ongoing dialogue for mutual learning and understanding, knowledge exchanges, and once again, really looking at very practical things that are needed to make sure that small-scale fishers are informed and feel comfortable, including from a cultural perspective, in contributing to the process. And their own internal decision-making process are factored in terms of their own timelines and the needs to discuss these things internally before and during a conversation with third parties, be that the government or potentially also third private parties. And I think one important point I want to mention, because I know colleagues at UNAM have done some research on the question of benefit sharing, have some practical suggestions, is seeing how from the international level and the biodiversity level, there is this like really strong understanding of not any benefits will work, even if many benefits are great. And we've heard about potential income coming from fees from external people entering into small-scale fishers' grounds, how the benefits need to be understood from the perspective of the small-scale fishers themselves. They need to be culturally appropriate, respond to their needs and their aspirations for development, and actually being in themselves a way to strengthen their own structures for management of the resources, for decision-making, and for pursuing their own view of sustainable development. So once again, it's really important to see how the understanding of the impacts and the benefits, and then the consent, the agreement, the partnership that can be built need to be very much a process of mutual understanding. And usually it requires more effort and more investment in understanding the viewpoints and the variety of also knowledge and needs on the side of small-scale fishers. So this in a way presents quite a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. It's really about supporting the agency of small-scale fishers in this process, and enhancing their choice and their capabilities to pursue their choices, and eventually exercise control over the fishing resources. And so moving away from a sort of technocratic process and really looking at how we effectively collaborate and understand opportunities to work together across different development priorities and cultures. And that has to do also with the creation of, so not just maybe the management of fisheries, but also, as was mentioned earlier, potentially the creation of marine protected areas, of fishing reserves, where again, internationally, we have some clear standards as to what is needed for that to be acceptable and respective of human rights of small-scale fishers. And so ensuring effective participation along the lines just discussed in terms of the partnership building approach, but also ensuring continued access of territories, even where we may have conservation measures, as long as that access contributes to conservation and sustainable use approaches. And very much understanding where there may already be areas that are conserved by indigenous or communities, and even if that may not be gazetted or officially recognized in law at the national level. And finally, this is my last slide. There are, of course, other important human rights issues. Many have been mentioned before, but I think, again, we're hoping that the research from our colleagues at the University of Namibia can provide maybe additional insights that have to do with the specific role and needs of women within small-scale fishers, and how there may be a need to think specifically about the gender dimensions, also in the context of impacts, understanding of benefits and methods for sharing those benefits, and consent. And ensuring, again, in terms of support, that women and men have equal access to any support that may be provided to them, so that they can be better able to participate in those decision-making processes. Something else that we have discussed with FAO colleagues and also the UN is how potentially there's still little understanding that small-scale fishing activists might actually be serving as environmental human rights defenders. They may oppose certain decisions as a way to protect their own rights, and also to protect the sustainable use of fishing resources. And as such, they actually should count on the government and courts to have an enabling environment for them to voice their concerns and to claim respect of their rights. Often they may be mischaracterized, and there have been instances in other countries where they've even been criminalized for their activist activities. So it's really important to understand that they may be defending their own rights, and they may be also contributing to the sustainability of the sector, and allowing and protecting them and allowing them to serve that function, which actually benefits us all. And the final point, which is really another tricky one, is that, of course, everybody needs to respect the human rights of others. Of course, the state has particular obligations to ensure respect for human rights, and this is done through participatory processes to develop policies, through participatory processes to develop laws, but also then including in legislation the necessary guarantees to ensure protection of human rights, including from infringements that may come from the private sector. On the other hand, the private sector itself, and so businesses, and we can think about the large-scale fishing sector there, also have their own responsibility to respect human rights, and more are expected to do so beyond what may be necessarily asked of them at the national level, and really be equally attentive and engaged in that role of allowing small-scale fishers and indigenous peoples to articulate their needs in their own terms and identify benefits as part of those processes of impact assessments and consent, and generally trying to create those partnerships with them. So I think I'll stop here, and I hope that these indications I provided from international law both resonate with what was discussed earlier today, but also will be picked up tomorrow with the more national level research that has been carried out by my colleagues at the University of Namibia.
Thank you so much, Professor Elisa, for your presentation. I've just been taking a look, and there are no questions at the moment. I'll maybe give the participants a couple of minutes. Maybe some questions will come through. But in terms of your presentation, thank you for bringing in the context in terms of the identification issue. Who are the small-scale fishers? It's a question that was asked time and again during our consultations at the local level. You brought in the issue of safeguards, consent, benefit sharing. You brought in the perspective of human rights issues, and also the perspective of enabling small-scale fishers to raise their voice in terms of being able to participate in discussions and conversations that have a direct impact on their livelihoods. All of these are extremely relevant issues to Namibia's current situation, and we have experienced them in the field at the local level. We know that part of this process obviously is to develop engagement strategies where we can get responses, because this process is new. Everybody's looking at it from a different lens, from a different perspective, and at the end of the day, we need to ensure that we come together and actually have results that are not only balanced, but are also useful and are evidence-based and are supporting the small-scale fishers that we are speaking about here. I still don't see any questions, so we're going to move towards closure for today. And just to remind everybody that our webinar continues tomorrow, starting at 2 o'clock, same time slot. The role of the FAO is to provide a technical support to the process, and the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources, as the line ministry, has really taken full ownership in terms of the development process for the National Plan of Action for Small-Scale Fisheries. And in terms of that, the potential developing small-scale fisheries in Namibia is being viewed at across various sectors, across various considerations, one being the legal, one being the second being socioeconomics, the third being fisheries management issues. And then we also have several cross-cutting issues that have emerged, such as environmental issues, including obviously looking at other tools and processes such as the ecosystem approach to fisheries management, for example. So a lot is emerging from this webinar, as well as from the consultations that we have had. And one key issue that has emerged is the conversation around resource restoration versus resource utilization. This conversation needs to be had. And we need to continue having this conversation, and we need to get to a conclusion, because we need to understand how can we continue securing fish for communities whose livelihoods depend on the fish, but at the same time be able to sustainably manage the resource. It's a very, very, very tricky balance that we need to attain as a country. And I believe that as the conversation moves forward, we will be able to get light, and we will be able to, as a collective, have some perhaps new approaches that can emerge, that can resolve this particular issue. So in terms of our webinar, we have come to a close. Just looking one more time at the Q&A, going once, going twice, if there are no more questions. I don't see any questions coming through. So Prof. Elisa, thank you so much for your presentation. It is really great to have you here with us, and thank you for your participation. So with that, John, are you still here? Let me just take a look. John, are you still here?
Yes, I'm still here.
All right, please, John, I would like to hand the floor over to you to close day one. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alusha, and all the participants. I think these were very informative presentations, and we appreciate your contribution, colleagues, and your participations. As a ministry, we indicated that we are committed to engage, and these are the type of engagement